Captain Alexander Reed's polished boots clicked against the raised metal flooring of Fort Meade Naval Cyber Command's the Guardian control deck. The commanding sound echoed through the cavernous room, drawing the attention of junior officers who straightened their posture instinctively at his approach. The cold blue light of numerous monitors cast an eerie glow across the space, illuminating faces bathed in the artificial radiance of America's most advanced cyber warfare system. He noticed her immediately. A woman in an olive-drab flight suit, devoid of any rank insignia, stood near the primary command node studying a tablet with unnerving focus. Her posture was relaxed, her presence utterly unassuming amidst the technical symphony of the command center. But it was precisely this casual intrusion that ignited a spark of fury in Reed's chest. This was his domain, his command, his responsibility. "You there?" He barked, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of environmental systems. "This is a restricted area." The woman didn't look up. Her finger continued tracing complex schematics on her tablet, her attention seemingly absorbed by whatever data flowed across the screen. Several junior officers exchanged nervous glances, sensing the gathering storm in their commander's expression. Reed closed the distance in 3 deliberate strides. He was a man accustomed to being the loudest, smartest person in any room, and her quiet focus was an infuriating affront to his command. "Ma'am, I don't know what low-level intelligence billet you wandered out of, but this is Fleet Cybernetics Command. This is the heart of our digital warfare capability. It is not a library for civilian analysts to get lost in." Still, she gave no reaction. That was the final insult. Reed's hand shot out to grab her arm. He didn't just grab it. He used his considerable size and strength to spin her around, pressing her back against the cold steel of a server rack bulkhead. The metallic thud was soft, but echoed like a gunshot in the suddenly silent room. The chatter of technicians died instantly. Wide eyes turned toward the confrontation. Reed leaned in his face, a mask of controlled fury, his voice a threatening hiss, meant for her alone, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I gave you a lawful order, ma'am. This is a restricted area. For the last time, identify yourself and your purpose here, or I will have you in the brig so fast your head will spin." Her eyes, the color of a calm gray sea, finally lifted from the tablet and met his. They held no fear, no anger, no surprise. They held nothing but a quiet analytical stillness, as if she were examining a curious specimen. But somewhere in the back of the room, standing in the shadows near the aft entrance, Commodore William Lawrence felt a cold dread crawl up his spine. He observed the way she braced herself against the wall, not with fear but with the perfectly balanced low center of gravity stance of someone trained in advanced close-quarters combat. He noticed how her fingers didn't flinch, her thumb resting calmly near the edge of her tablet. Lawrence knew in that instant exactly who she was and what Reed had just done. In the Pentagon Situation Room, 3,000 miles away, a secure phone began to ring. The Joint Chiefs were about to receive a report about an incident that would shake the very foundation of naval command. An incident that began not with an attack from a foreign adversary, but with a captain's arrogance and a single fateful mistake. Captain Reed had just physically assaulted the architect of America's entire cyber defense system. Fort Meade Naval Cyber Command stood as America's digital fortress. Established in 2011 as part of the nation's response to growing cyber threats, it had evolved into something far more significant than its public profile suggested. Behind its unassuming exterior of modernized military architecture lay a labyrinth of the most sophisticated computer systems ever developed for warfare. The Guardian system, officially designated Advanced Cyber Warfare Simulator Mark VII, occupied the facility's core. 6,000 square feet of quantum processors holographic interfaces, and cutting-edge AI neural networks devoted to modeling, predicting, and countering digital threats. To the uninitiated, it appeared as a science fiction set, a cavern of humming servers bathed in blue light, where the digital ghosts of future naval battles were fought and refought thousands of times before real sailors ever faced an enemy. The heart of this digital citadel was the command deck, a raised platform surrounded by tiered workstations where elite operators monitored global cyber threats in real time. On the main display wall, a virtual map of the world flickered with countless small lights, each representing a detected intrusion attempt against American military networks. In the week before, that map had grown increasingly active, with a swarm of incursions originating from Russian and Chinese servers. The pattern matched intelligence reports of escalating tensions following recent sanctions. America's digital sentinels were on high alert. What few people knew, what only those with the highest security clearances understood, was that Guardian wasn't merely a defensive system. It was the visible portion of something far more significant, Project Chimera. Born in the dying days of the Cold War, when Soviet and American programmers first began exploring the possibilities of cyber warfare, Chimera had evolved over 30 years into America's most powerful offensive digital weapon. Its existence was known only to a handful of flag officers and the small cadre of engineers who maintained it. The system's true capabilities remained classified at a level beyond top secret, but rumors persisted among those with the clearance to hear them. Chimera could allegedly penetrate any networked system, disable power grids, derail trains, crash financial markets, or even take control of military hardware. It was whispered that during a classified exercise in 2017, Chimera had shut down an entire carrier strike group's electronic systems without leaving a trace of its intrusion. At the core of Guardian's defenses lay Protocol Omega, an autonomous failsafe designed to completely isolate the system in the event of catastrophic cyber attack. Like a digital iron curtain, it would sever all external connections while maintaining internal functionality. The protocol had never been fully activated outside controlled testing environments. Its complexity was legendary among the engineers who understood its architecture. For most, at Fort Meade, Protocol Omega was simply another technical term in an ocean of military jargon. Few understood that its activation would instantly alert the highest levels of government to a potential existential threat to national security. Fewer still knew that a single person had written its foundational code line by meticulous line. Captain Alexander Reed was naval royalty. His grandfather had commanded a destroyer during the Cuban Missile Crisis. His father had served as an admiral during Desert Storm. Reed himself had graduated near the top of his class at Annapolis before distinguishing himself as a SEAL team commander in Afghanistan and Iraq. His office walls displayed an impressive collection of medals and commendations, each telling a story of battlefield prowess and physical courage. An expert marksman, he had recorded confirmed kills at distances exceeding a mile. His close-quarters combat abilities were legendary. During a hostage rescue operation in 2010, he had single-handedly eliminated 4 terrorists in under 6 seconds. Reed embodied the physical ideal of a naval officer 6'2", with the broad shoulders and narrow waist of a competitive swimmer, close-cropped dark hair going silver at the temples, and piercing blue eyes that rarely blinked during confrontations. His uniform was always impeccable, each ribbon and medal precisely placed according to regulations. But Alexander Reed's most defining characteristic was his absolute certainty. He had been raised in a world of clear hierarchies where authority came with rank and respect, was commanded rather than earned. Throughout his career, this certainty had served him well in combat situations where decisive action saved lives. Yet that same certainty created blind spots. Reed valued tradition and protocol above adaptation. He respected the chain of command and expected others to do the same. Most dangerously, he trusted the visible symbols of authority: uniforms, insignias, medals, more than demonstrated competence. This mindset had nearly cost lives during Reed's deployment to Fallujah in 2004. His team had been assigned to secure a suspected insurgent stronghold. Intelligence reports suggested minimal resistance, but a young intelligence analyst, a woman fresh from Quantico with no combat experience, had noticed discrepancies in the pattern analysis. She tried to warn Reed about signs of a potential ambush. Reed had dismissed her concerns with barely concealed contempt. "I've been doing this since you were in high school, Lieutenant. Leave the tactical planning to those of us who've actually seen combat." He had led the mission according to the original intelligence. The team walked directly into an ambush. Two of his men were seriously wounded before Reed managed to extract the unit. Later, he was commended for his bravery under fire and his tactical skill in saving his team. No one mentioned the ignored warning. The young intelligence officer was transferred to another unit. The lesson Reed took from the experience wasn't humility, but confirmation of his own exceptionalism. Even when things went wrong, his abilities had prevailed. Now, as commander of the Guardian facility, Reed ran his operation with the same rigid adherence to hierarchy and tradition. Every morning began with a formal inspection. Uniforms were expected to be perfect shoes, polished to a mirror shine. Reports followed strict formatting guidelines. Any deviation was met with swift correction. Under Reed's command, the facility functioned with military precision, but innovation stagnated. Junior officers learned quickly to follow procedures rather than suggest improvements. His technical staff focused on maintenance rather than enhancement. "Guardian isn't broken," Reed often said during staff meetings. "Our job is to keep it that way, not reinvent the wheel." The day before the incident, Reed had received word that an inspection team would be visiting the facility. The message had been light on details, but heavy on implications. High-ranking officials would be evaluating the readiness of Guardian systems and personnel. Reed had ordered an intensive preparation process. Work shifts were doubled. Every inch of the facility was cleaned. Every system was run through diagnostic cycles. By the morning of the expected visit, Fort Meade Naval Cyber Command gleamed like a recruitment poster. Reed stood proud in his perfectly pressed uniform, ready to impress whoever walked through those doors. He never expected it would be an unassuming woman in a plain flight suit with no visible rank. He never imagined his career was about to implode. Admiral James Montgomery had served his country for over 50 years. At 72, his weathered face told the story of a man who had faced the worst the world could throw at him and remained standing. His once robust frame had grown leaner with age, but he still carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of command. The collection of medals on his dress uniform spoke to a lifetime of service, courage, and sacrifice. Montgomery had come of age during the height of the Cold War. As a young ensign aboard the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he had experienced firsthand the terrifying prospect of nuclear war. He still remembered the tension on the bridge as they tracked Soviet submarines, the world holding its breath, as two superpowers stood at the precipice. One moment from that crisis had defined Montgomery's leadership philosophy for the next 5 decades. When a Soviet submarine was detected near the blockade line, the Enterprise's captain had ordered immediate preparation for depth charges. A young officer had spoken up, questioning whether they should attempt communication first. In that moment, with war seconds away, the captain had done something extraordinary. He had listened. The delay allowed them to receive new orders from Washington, preventing what they would later learn could have triggered nuclear retaliation. "The loudest voice isn't always the wisest," Montgomery often told young officers. "True strength lies in knowing when to act and when to listen. Montgomery had risen through the ranks on the strength of this philosophy, eventually commanding the Pacific Fleet during the final years of the Cold War. Under his leadership, numerous potential confrontations with Soviet naval forces had been diffused through a combination of firm resolve and careful restraint. After his active duty retirement, Montgomery had transitioned to advisory roles within the Pentagon. His Cold War experience proved invaluable as America faced new threats in the digital domain. He became one of the few senior officers to fully embrace the potential of cyber warfare, recognizing it as the new front line of national security. It was during a lecture at the Naval War College in 2005 that Montgomery had first encountered Diana Hayes. She was presenting a theoretical framework for quantum encryption that left most of the audience bewildered. Montgomery, though not a technical expert, recognized the strategic implications immediately. After the lecture, he had approached her with questions that demonstrated he'd grasped the core concepts despite the technical complexity. Their conversation stretched from minutes to hours, continuing through dinner and well into the evening. By morning, Montgomery had made a decision he would become her advocate within the naval hierarchy. Their relationship evolved into something resembling father and daughter. Montgomery provided the political capital and institutional knowledge to navigate the labyrinthine defense establishment. Hayes provided the technical brilliance to transform America's cyber capabilities. When Project Chimera faced budget cuts in 2009, Montgomery had personally appealed to the Secretary of Defense. When skeptical admirals questioned whether a woman with limited military experience should lead such a critical program, Montgomery had staked his reputation on her abilities. "I've served alongside men with every qualification imaginable," he told the Naval Operations Board. "I've never met anyone, man or woman, who understands the future of warfare better than Diana Hayes." Now sitting in his Georgetown apartment, Admiral Montgomery reviewed the classified brief about Hayes's upcoming inspection of Fort Meade. The document contained details about potential vulnerabilities in Protocol Omega that Hayes had theorized might exist. Montgomery noted with concern that the facility commander, Captain Reed, had a reputation for being traditional to a fault. "That young man better have the sense to recognize brilliance when he sees it," Montgomery muttered to himself as he closed the file. He had no idea how catastrophically that hope was about to be disappointed. Diana Hayes had never intended to join the military. The daughter of one of the earliest NSA computer scientists, she had grown up surrounded by the language of mathematics and logic. Her father had been part of the original ARPANET team in the 1960s, helping to build what would eventually become the Internet. Dinner conversations in the Hayes household often revolved around cryptographic theories and network architecture rather than typical family topics. By age 12, Diana had written her first encryption algorithm. By 16, she had earned a full scholarship to MIT. Her doctoral thesis on quantum computing had been immediately classified by the government upon submission. Before her 25th birthday, she held PhDs from both MIT and Caltech, with specializations in quantum computing and systems architecture. The intelligence community had recruited her aggressively, but Diana had initially resisted, preferring the academic freedom of research institutions. Everything changed in 2001 when a series of coordinated cyber attacks temporarily disabled several military networks. The sophistication of the intrusions alarmed defense officials who recognized they were unprepared for this new form of warfare. Hayes was brought in as a consultant. What was intended as a 6-month assignment evolved into a career. She discovered she had a natural talent for anticipating adversaries' techniques, a chess master's ability to think many moves ahead. More importantly, she found purpose in defending national security in this new domain. Her rise through the ranks was unprecedented. Though technically a civilian contractor at first, her expertise earned her increasing responsibility. When it became clear that her civilian status limited her authority, she accepted a direct commission as a lieutenant commander, an extraordinary step that raised eyebrows throughout the Navy. Some officers resented her rapid advancement, viewing it as preferential treatment that disrespected traditional career paths. Others recognized the unique skills she brought to an increasingly technical service. Admiral Montgomery's mentorship proved crucial during this period. He taught her the unwritten rules of military culture, the importance of respecting tradition while driving innovation, and how to navigate the political waters of the Pentagon. Most importantly, he showed her how to lead without relying on rank or intimidation. Command isn't about making people follow orders, he had told her. It's about making them want to follow you. Hayes took this lesson to heart, developing a leadership style based on demonstrated expertise rather than asserted authority. She never raised her voice. She never demanded respect based on her rank. Instead, she earned it through consistent displays of competence and concern for those under her command. By 2018, Hayes had risen to the rank of Rear Admiral and served as Director of Project Chimera. Under her leadership, America's cyber capabilities had advanced decades beyond public knowledge. Her counterparts in Russia and China considered her the most dangerous adversary in the digital domain, a reputation earned through several classified operations that had neutralized foreign threats without a single shot being fired. The morning of the Fort Meade inspection, Hayes made a calculated decision to arrive without the trappings of her rank. She wanted to observe the facility's operations in their natural state, not the polished performance that would inevitably be presented to a visiting admiral. She chose the olive-drab flight suit standard utility wear for naval aviators specifically because it allowed her to blend in. Without rank insignia or name tags, she would be just another visitor, perhaps a technical specialist or analyst. This approach had served her well in previous inspections, allowing her to identify issues that might otherwise be concealed. Hayes had particular concerns about Fort Meade's implementation of Protocol Omega. Her recent analysis had identified a potential recursive vulnerability, a loop in the code that could, under specific circumstances, cause the system to interpret its own security measures as an attack. If triggered, this flaw could theoretically escalate into a catastrophic system failure. The vulnerability was theoretical. Hayes wanted to verify whether it existed in the actual implementation before ordering a system-wide update that would require taking Guardian offline for several days. As her car approached Fort Meade that morning, Hayes reviewed the technical schematics on her tablet. The complexity of the code was staggering, millions of lines developed over decades, layer upon layer of security protocols interacting in ways that even their creators sometimes struggled to fully comprehend. But to Hayes, this digital labyrinth was as familiar as her childhood home. She had written significant portions of it herself. She could navigate its architecture with an intuitive understanding that bordered on symbiotic. Where others saw impenetrable complexity, she recognized patterns and possibilities. She passed through security with her credentials, but asked the guards not to announce her arrival. Her plan was simple: observe normal operations, access a terminal to check the specific code implementation, then reveal her identity to conduct the formal inspection. Hayes had no way of knowing that her unassuming entrance was about to trigger the very vulnerability she had come to investigate. The command center of Guardian hummed with activity as Hayes entered. Dozens of operators monitored screens displaying real-time cyber threat assessments from around the globe. The main holographic display dominated the center of the room, projecting a three-dimensional representation of ongoing digital traffic across military networks. The technology was impressive. Quantum processors calculating defense scenarios at speeds impossible just years earlier, artificial intelligence systems identifying threat patterns, holographic interfaces displaying complex data. in intuitive visual formats. Yet Hayes noted with professional interest how the human elements remained rooted in traditional military structure. Officers called status reports with formal precision. Logs were maintained with meticulous attention to protocol. The language of naval tradition, terms like deck instead of floor and aft instead of rear, permeated the technical environment. This blending of cutting-edge technology with centuries-old naval culture fascinated Hayes. She had long believed that the strength of America's cyber defense lay precisely in this combination, the innovative potential of new technology tempered by the disciplined structure of military tradition. She moved quietly toward one of the secondary monitoring stations, her eyes cataloging minute details that most visitors would miss. The temperature regulation systems were running at optimal levels. The emergency protocols were prominently displayed. The personnel appeared well-trained and focused. Overall, Captain Reed ran a tight ship. Hayes had to acknowledge that much. Then she noticed something concerning. On one of the auxiliary screens, a diagnostic program was running a standard security check on Protocol Omega. Within the scrolling data, Hayes spotted an anomaly, a pattern in the system response time that matched her theoretical vulnerability. She moved closer to the terminal, her interest sharpening. Pulling out her tablet, she began comparing the live system data with her theoretical models. The correlation was stronger than she had anticipated. The vulnerability wasn't merely possible, it was present and potentially severe. Hayes became so absorbed in this analysis that she temporarily forgot her surroundings. Her mind raced through potential implications and solutions, calculating risk factors and mitigation strategies with machine-like efficiency. This deep focus made her seem oblivious to the approaching footsteps of Captain Reed. She wasn't oblivious. Part of her situational awareness noted his approach, but the potential security vulnerability took priority over social niceties. When Reed confronted her, Hayes made a split-second decision to maintain her cover temporarily. The vulnerability she had discovered warranted further investigation before she diverted attention to explaining her presence. A few more minutes of data collection could prove crucial. This decision, logical from her perspective, appeared as insubordination to Reed. His reaction, while excessive, was predictable given his personality and training. The physical confrontation was an unfortunate but anticipated risk of her approach. As Reed pressed her against the server rack, Hayes remained calm, continuing to process the security implications of what she had discovered. Even in this confrontation, her mind operated on multiple tracks, analyzing Reed's behavior as a symptom of broader cultural issues, while simultaneously calculating how long she could maintain her cover before the situation escalated beyond acceptable parameters. What Hayes couldn't anticipate was how this human confrontation was about to intersect with the digital vulnerability she had detected. The specific terminal Reed had pushed her against contained one of the primary neural network nodes for Protocol Omega. The physical impact, slight as it was, created a momentary power fluctuation in the sensitive equipment. Under normal circumstances, this fluctuation would be automatically corrected by redundant systems. But the specific code vulnerability Hayes had identified made the system misinterpret this fluctuation. The neural network registered it as an anomalous pattern, potentially indicating a sophisticated intrusion attempt. Protocol Omega began its preliminary response sequence, initiating a Level 1 security scan. Commodore William Lawrence had served in the Navy for 30 years, witnessing the evolution of warfare from the physical to the digital domain. At 55, he bridged the gap between the cold warriors of Montgomery's generation and the tech-savvy officers of the modern era. Lawrence had first encountered Hayes 15 years earlier during a classified operation to counter a Russian cyber intrusion against NATO systems. As the tactical commander, he had watched in amazement as Hayes, then a newly commissioned lieutenant commander, dismantled the Russian attack with surgical precision. She didn't just stop them, Lawrence had reported afterward. She left their system so thoroughly scrambled that their own programmers couldn't figure out what had happened. From that moment, Lawrence had developed an almost reverent respect for Hayes's abilities, though they had worked together only occasionally. Since then, he recognized her immediately when she entered the command center. Her presence, without formal announcement, immediately told him this was not a standard inspection. Lawrence had intended to approach her discreetly, but operational demands had delayed him. He was reviewing threat assessments when he saw Reed confronting her. The Commodore started moving immediately, but distance and intervening personnel slowed his progress. When Reed physically assaulted Hayes, Lawrence broke into a run. He was still several stations away when he saw the first warning light begin to flash on a nearby console. Ensign Michael Parker was the first to notice the anomaly. A former ethical hacker recruited directly into the Navy's cyber warfare program, Parker possessed an intuitive understanding of system behaviors that formal training couldn't provide. "Sir, we have an unusual pattern in the Protocol Omega monitoring system," Parker called out, his young face illuminated by the red warning indicators on his screen. The warning caught Reed's attention momentarily, distracting him from the woman he had pinned against the server rack. "Explain," he snapped, not releasing his grip. "The system is showing signs of initiating a Level 1 security scan, but there's no apparent trigger. The neural network is registering what it believes to be an intrusion attempt, but I can't identify any actual intrusion markers." Parker's fingers flew across his keyboard, trying to isolate the cause. On the main holographic display, a single line of crimson code appeared amidst the placid blue and green data streams. Then another. Within seconds, a cascade of error messages began to scroll across multiple monitors. Lawrence reached Reed just as the first alarm sounded. "Captain, release her immediately," he ordered, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of urgent command. Reed turned, surprise and anger flashing across his face at this unexpected intervention. "Commodore, this civilian has breached security protocols and refused to identify herself. I'm well within regulations to detain her." "That's no civilian," Lawrence said, his eyes meeting Hayes's calm gray gaze. "And right now, she may be the only person who can prevent what's about to happen." As if summoned by his words, the primary alert system activated. A synthesized voice echoed through the command center. "Warning, Protocol Omega security scan has detected anomalous patterns. Potential intrusion detected. Initiating isolation procedures." The lights on the command deck flickered, dimmed, and then shifted to emergency red. On the main display, the normal operational data dissolved into a chaotic storm of error messages and warning indicators. Reed finally released Hayes, his attention diverted to the growing crisis. "What the hell is happening?" he demanded of the room in general. Parker answered, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Sir, Protocol Omega has initiated and is escalating rapidly. It's interpreting something as a major cyber attack and implementing countermeasures, but I can't identify any actual intrusion." Lawrence watched as Hayes calmly straightened her flight suit, her eyes scanning the various displays with analytical precision. He knew that look she was assembling pieces of a puzzle that no one else in the room could even see. "Captain," Lawrence said quietly to Reed, "I strongly suggest you allow the Admiral to access a terminal immediately." "Admiral?" Reed's face registered confusion, followed by dawning horror as he turned back toward the woman he had just physically assaulted. "What, Admiral?" Before Lawrence could respond, a new message appeared on the main display. "Protocol Omega Level 2 engaged. External communications severed. Preparing defensive countermeasures." The implications were immediately clear to everyone with security clearance in the room. Level 2 meant the facility was now completely cut off from the outside world. No communications in or out. and Level 3, which would follow automatically if the perceived threat continued, would initiate active countermeasures against what the system perceived as hostile networks. In the worst-case scenario, Chimera's offensive capabilities could be activated against what the AI mistakenly identified as the source of the attack. The potential for friendly fire in the cyber domain was catastrophic. Reed's face had lost all color as he processed these implications along with the revelation about the woman he had assaulted. His career, his reputation, possibly even his freedom, were now in jeopardy. But more importantly, a critical national security system was spiraling toward a potentially disastrous failure. Lawrence moved to a communication terminal and attempted to contact external command. As expected, the system returned only error messages. Protocol Omega had severed all external connections. "We're isolated," he announced, "and we have approximately 15 minutes before Level 3 engages." The command center erupted into controlled chaos. Officers called out status reports. Technicians frantically attempted to identify the phantom intrusion that had triggered the protocol. Reed stood frozen, his authority suddenly uncertain in this unprecedented crisis. Through it all, Hayes remained calm, her eyes fixed on the central holographic display where the chaotic data told a story only she could fully read. Lawrence recognized her expression. She had already diagnosed the problem and was formulating a solution. "Sir," Parker called out, his voice cutting through the noise, "the protocol is misinterpreting its own security measures as an external attack. It's created a recursive loop that's amplifying with each cycle." Reed snapped back to attention, falling back on training and procedure in the face of uncertainty. "Implement standard containment protocols. I want every system isolated and individually verified." "That won't work," Hayes said, her voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable authority that silenced the room. "The standard protocols are part of the recursive loop. They'll only accelerate the process." She turned to face Reed directly, her gray eyes meeting his with neither anger nor triumph, only focused determination. "Captain, this facility is experiencing exactly the vulnerability I came to investigate. Protocol Omega has a fundamental flaw in its core architecture that can be triggered under specific conditions. Those conditions have now been met." Reed stared at her professional training warring with personal pride. "And you are—" Lawrence stepped forward. "Captain Reed, this is Rear Admiral Diana Hayes, Director of Project Chimera, and the original architect of Protocol Omega. I suggest you listen very carefully to whatever she has to say." The revelation sent visible shockwaves through the command center. Junior officers exchanged glances of disbelief. Technical specialists whispered in stunned recognition of the name. Hayes paid no attention to the reaction. She was already moving toward a secondary engineering terminal, one that had been dark and ignored while everyone clustered around the main command consoles. "Ensign Parker," she called out, "I need you at this station. Bring your access codes." Parker hurried to her side, his expression a mixture of awe and professional focus. This was the legendary Diana Hayes, the woman whose papers on quantum encryption had inspired him to join the Navy's cyber program. As they worked, Lawrence pulled Reed aside. "Captain, I need you to clear the non-essential personnel from the command deck immediately. What's about to happen is classified beyond your current authorization level." Reed nodded, stiffly, military discipline reasserting itself despite the personal catastrophe unfolding around him. He began issuing evacuation orders, organizing the controlled exodus of junior personnel while maintaining a skeleton crew of senior technicians. As the room cleared, Hayes pulled a small coiled cable from a pouch on her flight suit and connected her personal tablet directly to the maintenance port of the engineering terminal. The other end she plugged into a shielded port below the console. Her fingers began to move across the tablet surface, not typing, but dancing in a fluid, intricate ballet of gestures, swipes, and taps. She wasn't fighting the system. She was communicating with it, speaking its own native corrupted language. Lines of pure, raw code began to scroll across her screen, a language so complex and dense that it looked more like ancient hieroglyphics than modern programming. Parker watched in astonishment as Hayes navigated the system architecture with impossible speed and precision. "Admiral, how are you bypassing the security lockouts? The quantum authentication should prevent any manual override." Hayes didn't look up from her work. "I'm not bypassing them, Ensign. I'm using an administrative backdoor that exists in the original architecture, a safeguard I built into the system from the beginning." On the main holographic display, amidst the swirling red chaos of error messages, a single thin line of pure white light appeared. It began to draw a shape, a perfect circle, pushing back against the digital storm, imposing order on the chaos. Lawrence smiled grimly as he watched the white circle expand. "She's doing it," he murmured to himself. "She's actually doing it." The alarms continued to wail as Hayes worked the synthetic voice, announcing with mechanical precision, "Protocol Omega Level 3 initiating in 10 minutes." Reed stood transfixed, watching as the woman he had dismissed and assaulted single-handedly battled the runaway system. His world of rigid hierarchies, shiny metals, and loud, self-assured pronouncements was being shattered by the quiet competence of the unassuming figure at the engineering terminal. What none of them realized, what only the most sophisticated intelligence agencies would later piece together, was that the vulnerability Hayes had identified wasn't merely a flaw. It was the signature of something far more deliberate and sinister. Hidden within the chaotic data storm, masked by the very security protocols designed to detect it, a sophisticated piece of malicious code was executing its final stages of infiltration. The timing of Hayes's physical confrontation with Reed had inadvertently accelerated a cyber attack that had been meticulously planned by a hostile foreign intelligence service. The true crisis was only beginning to unfold. The command center of Fort Meade Naval Cyber Command had transformed in seconds. Where calm blue operational lighting had once created an atmosphere of controlled efficiency, harsh crimson emergency systems now cast an apocalyptic glow across worried faces. The steady hum of cooling systems had been overwhelmed by a rising chorus of alarms, each with its own distinct tone and meaning, combining into a symphony of electronic panic. "Protocol Omega Level 3 initiating in 9 minutes 45 seconds, the synthesized voice announced with machine-like indifference. Captain Reed struggled to process the cascading disasters unfolding around him. His confrontation with the woman now revealed as Admiral Hayes had inadvertently triggered what appeared to be the very vulnerability she had come to investigate. But the implications went far beyond a simple system malfunction or his career-ending assault on a superior officer. The nation's most critical cyber defense system was spiraling toward catastrophic failure. "All stations report status," Reed commanded, his voice carrying the practiced authority of battlefield command. Only those who knew him well could detect the subtle undertone of strain. Years of combat had trained him to function under pressure, to compartmentalize personal concerns in the face of immediate threats. That training was being tested to its limits. Junior officers called back status reports in rapid succession, each more alarming than the last. Primary networks were failing. Communication channels had gone dark. External defense systems were being flagged as hostile entities. Lieutenant Jameson at the cybersecurity station looked up from her terminal face, pale in the red emergency lighting. "Sir Guardian is interpreting our own defensive measures as attack signatures. It's creating a feedback loop, amplifying the perceived threat with each cycle." Reed moved to the central command console, scanning the chaotic display for patterns he could understand. Unlike the specialized technical staff around him, Reed's expertise lay in tactical operations and personnel management. The scrolling code meant little to him, but the escalating alert status was unmistakable. "Can we initiate a manual shutdown?" he asked, searching for the simplest solution. Several technicians exchanged knowing glances before one spoke up. "Negative, sir. Protocol Omega specifically prevents manual shutdown once initiated. It's designed to continue operating even if human operators are compromised." The irony wasn't lost on Reed. A system designed to function autonomously in case humans were compromised was now compromised itself, and humans couldn't intervene. It was the fundamental paradox of automation. Removing human error often meant introducing machine error just at scales and speeds humans couldn't match. At the engineering terminal, Hayes and Parker worked with focused intensity, their fingers flying across keyboards and touch screens. Hayes maintained a preternatural calm, her movements precise and economical as she navigated through layers of security. "Admiral, I've isolated the recursive trigger," Parker reported, his young face illuminated by the screen's glow. "The pattern's signature it's unlike anything I've seen before. It's elegant, almost artistic in its complexity." Hayes nodded without looking up. "That's because it's not a random flaw or typical malware ensign. This is a deliberately crafted exploit designed specifically for Protocol Omega. Someone identified the theoretical vulnerability and engineered code to target it with surgical precision." This revelation sent a chill through the command center. What had initially seemed like a technical malfunction was something far more sinister, a sophisticated attack against America's primary cyber defense system. Reed approached the engineering station, his posture stiff with military formality. Professional training had taken over, pushing aside the personal humiliation of his earlier error. "Admiral Hayes, I need to understand exactly what we're facing." Hayes didn't pause in her work as she responded. "Captain, we're experiencing a sophisticated cyber attack disguised as a system malfunction. The attack has triggered Protocol Omega's isolation procedures, which would normally be the correct response to an intrusion. However, the malicious code has modified the protocol to interpret all external systems, including our own military networks, as hostile entities." "What happens when Level 3 initiates?" Reed asked, dreading the answer. "Chimera's offensive capabilities will automatically deploy against what the system identifies as sources of the attack." Hayes replied, her voice clinically detached. "In this case, that would include our own defense network, satellite systems, and possibly civilian infrastructure." The implications were staggering. Guardian controlled America's digital defense grid. If compromised, it could turn the nation's cyber weapons against its own systems. The potential for catastrophic damage was incalculable: power grids, failing communications, collapsing transportation systems thrown into chaos, all without a single bomb being dropped or shot being fired. Commodore Lawrence joined them at the terminal. "We need to notify the Pentagon immediately." "All external communications are blocked by Protocol Omega," Hayes reminded him. "That's by design. We have to solve this internally before we can re-establish contact." The synthesized voice provided another update. "Protocol Omega Level 3 initiating in 8 minutes 30 seconds. The command center fell into a tense rhythm of controlled crisis response. Reed organized the remaining personnel into teams, each focused on different aspects of the emergency. Lawrence supervised the isolation of critical systems to prevent further spread of the malicious code. Parker continued working directly with Hayes, serving as her interface with the Guardian systems. Outside the sealed facility, the first indications of trouble were registering at the Pentagon. The sudden communication blackout from Fort Meade had triggered automatic security protocols. Emergency teams were being mobilized. The Joint Chiefs were being notified. The Situation Room was preparing for potential escalation. No one yet understood that the fate of America's digital infrastructure now rested entirely in the hands of the woman whose authority had been so casually dismissed just 15 minutes earlier. DEFCON status has been raised to Level 3, sir. The announcement cut through the tense atmosphere of the Pentagon Situation Room. The Joint Chiefs exchanged grave looks across the polished conference table. The chairman turned to the Cyber Operations Liaison. What exactly are we dealing with? Fort Meade Naval Cyber Command has gone completely dark, sir. All communication channels are non-responsive. Protocol Omega appears to have been initiated, which indicates a severe cybersecurity breach. Could this be an exercise? Asked the Air Force Chief of Staff. Negative, sir. There are no scheduled exercises that would involve a complete communications blackout, and Protocol Omega is never activated in drills without prior notification to this office. The Secretary of Defense leaned forward. Do we have any indication of external attack, Russian or Chinese signatures? Impossible to determine without direct communication with Fort Meade, sir. The facility houses our primary cyber forensics capability. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs made a decision. Implement the Broken Arrow contingency. I want all military networks isolated from Guardian until we determine what we're dealing with. And get me Admiral Montgomery. Within minutes, emergency protocols were being implemented across all branches of the military. Critical systems were being segregated from the networks. Command centers were shifting to backup communications. Strategic assets were being placed on elevated alert status. It was the most serious cybersecurity crisis in American history, and no one at the Pentagon yet understood its true nature or origin. Commodore Lawrence watched Hayes and Parker battle the invisible enemy invading their systems, a memory surfacing from the early days of his career. In 1983, as a junior officer at the North American Aerospace Defense Command, Lawrence had experienced a false alarm that nearly triggered nuclear war. A computer glitch had misinterpreted a training scenario as a real Soviet missile launch. For 6 tense minutes, the United States had stood on the brink of initiating a retaliatory strike that could have ended civilization. That crisis had been averted by human intervention officers who questioned the system's interpretation and delayed response until the error could be confirmed. But Guardian's autonomous protocols were specifically designed to eliminate such human intervention operating independently if a cyber attack was detected. He approached Hayes, keeping his voice low. This reminds me of the '83 NORAD incident. Different technology, same fundamental problem. Hayes nodded without looking up from her work. The eternal paradox of automation. We remove human error only to introduce machine error. The difference is scale and speed. Lawrence watched as her fingers continued their intricate dance across the interface. We need Montgomery, he said quietly. Hayes paused for the briefest moment, then resumed her work. James would provide valuable perspective, but Protocol Omega has cut all communications. Not all, Lawrence replied. There's the quantum entanglement communication prototype in the secure lab. It's not connected to the main network. It might still function. Hayes's eyes flickered with interest. The QEC is experimental, limited bandwidth, point-to-point only. But it might work. Lawrence nodded. It's directly linked to the Pentagon QEC node. If it's still operational, we could establish communication. Go, Hayes said. See if you can reach Montgomery. We need all the help we can get. As Lawrence moved toward the secure lab, Hayes returned her attention to the crisis at hand. The white circle she had created in the chaotic red storm of the main display was holding steady, but not expanding. She was maintaining a defensive position, preventing the malicious code from further infiltration, but had yet to push it back. Protocol Omega Level 3, initiating in 7 minutes, announced the system. Parker looked up from his terminal, his young face showing the strain of concentrated effort. "Admiral, I'm seeing something unusual in the attack pattern. There's a signature embedded in the code. It looks familiar." Hayes examined the data on Parker's screen. "You're right. That encoding method is distinctive. It's based on a variation of the Fisher-Lynch algorithm developed for quantum-resistant cryptography." Parker's eyes widened. "But that's a methodology developed by the NSA and shared only with our closest intelligence partners," Hayes finished. "This attack is using our own techniques against us." The implication was clear and disturbing. The malicious code bore the hallmarks of American cyber weapons development. Either Allied intelligence services had turned against the United States, or more likely, American cyber weapons had been compromised and were being used by adversaries. Hayes stared at the code pattern, a memory surfacing from years earlier. David Chen. The pattern was unmistakably his work, not just the technique, but the specific implementation style. It was as distinctive as a painter's brushstrokes. Chen had been her most brilliant student, a prodigy recruited directly from MIT's computer science program. Where other programmers saw code as instructions, Chen saw it as art, elegant patterns that could be manipulated like musical compositions. His quantum encryption methods had advanced Chimera's capabilities by years, perhaps decades. Hayes remembered the day Chen had come to her office, his usual enthusiasm replaced by troubled intensity. "We're building something we can't control," he had told her. "These capabilities we're developing, they're too powerful, too dangerous. If they're ever compromised, the damage would be incalculable." "Every weapon throughout history has had safeguards," she had countered. "We're building those safeguards into Chimera." "But who safeguards the safeguards?" Chen had asked. "We're creating systems too complex for any human to fully understand. We're introducing vulnerabilities we don't even recognize as vulnerabilities." She had dismissed his concerns as philosophical rather than practical. Chen had become increasingly vocal in his opposition, eventually crossing lines that the military couldn't tolerate. He was discharged, his clearances revoked. 2 years later, intelligence reports suggested he had defected to China, taking his brilliant mind and, potentially, his knowledge of Chimera with him. Hayes had felt both betrayed and responsible. Had she failed to listen when she should have? And now here was his distinctive digital signature embedded in an attack that exploited exactly the vulnerability he had warned about. Hayes made a quick decision. "Parker, focus on isolating that signature. It may give us insight into the attack vector. I'm going to attempt to establish a quarantine zone around the core Guardian architecture." As they worked, Reed approached again, his initial shock now replaced by professional focus. "Admiral, my technical team reports that the cooling systems for the quantum processing core are showing signs of instability. If they fail, we could face physical damage to the hardware." Hayes processed this new threat without visible reaction. A sophisticated touch. The attackers aren't just targeting the software, they're trying to force a hardware failure as well. Classic multi-vector approach. Reed struggled to maintain his composure. Every revelation made the situation more dire, and his own expertise seemed increasingly inadequate. "What are your orders, Admiral?" It was a significant moment, the captain explicitly acknowledging Hayes's authority in his domain. His military training had overcome personal pride in the face of crisis. "Assign your best engineers to manually override the cooling system controls," Hayes directed. "If Protocol Omega has compromised the automated regulation, we'll need human operators to prevent overheating." Reed nodded and moved away to implement her instructions. As he organized the engineering team, he fought against the growing realization of his own role in this disaster. His dismissal of Hayes, his failure to recognize her authority, these weren't just personal mistakes. They had potentially catastrophic implications for national security. In the secure lab, Lawrence activated the quantum entanglement communication device. The experimental technology represented the bleeding edge of secure communications, a system theoretically impossible to intercept or jam because it relied on the quantum principle of entangled particles. The QEC terminal hummed to life, its specialized hardware unaffected by Protocol Omega's lockdown of standard communication systems. Lawrence entered his authentication codes and initiated a connection request to the Pentagon's matching device. For several tense seconds, nothing happened. Then the display illuminated with a simple message, "Connection established." Lawrence let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "This is Commodore William Lawrence, Fort Meade Naval Cyber Command. Priority Alpha Emergency Communication. I need to speak with Admiral James Montgomery immediately." After a brief delay, a familiar voice responded. "Lawrence, what the hell is happening there? The entire Pentagon is on high alert." "Admiral Montgomery, we have a critical situation. Protocol Omega has been triggered by what appears to be a sophisticated cyber attack. Admiral Hayes is on site attempting to contain the threat, but we're facing activation of Level 3 protocols in less than 7 minutes." There was a momentary silence as Montgomery processed this information. "Hayes is at Fort Meade. That wasn't scheduled until tomorrow." "She arrived early, sir. Unannounced inspection. There was an incident with Captain Reed before the system failure began." Montgomery's voice sharpened. "What kind of incident?" Lawrence hesitated. "Sir Reed failed to recognize the Admiral and physically confronted her. The situation was escalating when the first system anomalies appeared. A string of colorful naval expletives flowed through the quantum connection." When Montgomery spoke again, his voice was tightly controlled. "Put me through to the command center. Video, if possible." "Yes, sir." Lawrence connected the QEC to the command center's internal communication system. A holographic projection of Admiral Montgomery appeared near the central command station, his weathered face grave with concern. Hayes noticed the projection immediately, but continued her work, sparing only a glance and a nod of acknowledgement for her mentor. Montgomery surveyed the command center with the experienced eye of a career naval officer. He quickly assessed the situation displays, the personnel movements, and the central holographic projection showing Hayes' defensive white circle holding back the tide of red corruption. "Captain Reed," Montgomery called his voice, carrying the weight of 50 years of command. Reed approached the holographic projection and came to attention. "Admiral Montgomery, sir." "Report." Reed provided a concise summary of the situation, his training allowing him to deliver an organized assessment, despite the surrounding chaos. He made no attempt to minimize his own role in the initial confrontation, accepting full responsibility with military professionalism. Montgomery listened without interruption. When Reed finished, the older admiral's expression remained impassive, but his eyes conveyed volumes. "Captain, right now, your personal situation is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is supporting Admiral Hayes in resolving this crisis. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Now step aside. I need to speak with Diana." Hayes approached the holographic projection, her hands never ceasing their work on the tablet she carried. "James, we have a complex situation. The attack bears signatures of our own cyber weapons development program. Someone has turned our techniques against us." Montgomery's expression darkened. "Internal source. The code structure matches David Chen's work," Hayes replied quietly. "You remember him? The prodigy who went rogue hard to forget. Last intelligence had him in China." "Exactly. And now his methodologies are being used against us, targeting the specific vulnerability he warned about before his discharge." Montgomery's weathered face grew more serious. Timeline: Level 3 initiates in 6 minutes 20 seconds. At that point, Chimera's offensive capabilities will deploy against what the system perceives as hostile networks, including our own. Montgomery nodded, processing the implications. The Pentagon is implementing broken arrow protocols. All military networks are being isolated from Guardian. That will help limit potential damage. But civilian infrastructure remains vulnerable, Hayes replied. And if the attackers gain full access to Chimera's capabilities, even isolated military networks could be compromised through alternative vectors. Montgomery studied the central display, his decades of strategic experience, allowing him to grasp the situation despite its technical complexity. "You've established a defensive perimeter," he noted, indicating the white circle. "Holding pattern only," Hayes confirmed. "I need to push back the intrusion, but the attack is adapting to conventional countermeasures." Montgomery's eyes narrowed as he considered the problem. "Diana, remember Annapolis '09. A slight smile touched Hayes's lips, the first expression of anything but focused concentration since the crisis began. "The Naval Academy simulation. Yes. Sometimes the conventional approach is exactly what the enemy expects. What did I tell you then? When facing a superior tactical position, change the nature of the engagement," Hayes quoted. Montgomery nodded. "The attackers anticipate your technical response. They've studied your methods, perhaps even trained on them. But they don't know you like I do." Hayes's fingers paused over her tablet as she considered Montgomery's words. For a brief moment, her eyes unfocused, looking beyond the immediate crisis to something only she could see. "Captain Reed," she called suddenly. Reed approached immediately. "Admiral, I need direct access to the quantum processing core, not through the network physical access to the hardware itself." Reed looked startled. "The core is in a secure vault 3 levels below us. Protocol Omega should have sealed it automatically." "Override codes can open it," Hayes replied. "I need to modify the hardware configuration directly." Reed hesitated only for a second before nodding. "I'll take you there myself." As they prepared to leave the command center, Montgomery's holographic image spoke again. "Captain Reed, a moment." Reed turned back to face the projection. "Remember what the most dangerous words in military history are?" Montgomery said quietly. "Sir, I know what I'm doing." Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to step aside and let those with the right expertise lead. Especially when it challenges your perception of command. Reed stood straighter, meeting Montgomery's gaze directly. "Understood, sir." As Reed and Hayes left the command center, Montgomery turned his attention to Lawrence. "Will I need you to prepare for worst-case scenarios? If Level 3 initiates before they succeed, we'll need containment protocols for the entire eastern seaboard power grid." Lawrence nodded grimly. "Already underway, sir." In the Pentagon Situation Room, Montgomery's physical body turned to address the Joint Chiefs. "Gentlemen, we have less than 6 minutes to prevent the most significant cybersecurity breach in American history. I suggest we prepare accordingly." Hayes and Reed moved swiftly through the emergency-lit corridors, the red warning lights casting strange shadows as they descended toward the facility's heart, the quantum processing core that gave Guardian its unparalleled capabilities. "The core is housed in a superconductive chamber maintained at near absolute zero temperatures," Reed explained as they reached a reinforced security door. "The quantum bits require these conditions to maintain coherence." Hayes nodded. "The extreme cold also serves as a security measure. Any unauthorized physical access would trigger temperature fluctuations that alert security." Reed glanced at her with new respect. "You really did design every aspect of this system." "Not every aspect," Hayes replied as she entered her override codes into the security panel. Guardian has evolved beyond any single person's creation. It's a culmination of thousands of contributors over decades. I simply laid some of the foundation stones. The massive door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing another security checkpoint. 3 more layers of progressive security followed, each requiring higher authorization levels. At the final barrier, a retinal scanner combined with quantum key authentication, Hayes placed her eye against the scanner while simultaneously entering a 128-character code from memory. The innermost vault door opened to reveal a circular chamber dominated by a cylindrical structure encased in a transparent material that glistened with frost. Numerous cables and coolant pipes connected to the cylinder, feeding into wall conduits. The temperature in the room was noticeably lower, though environmental systems in the antechamber prevented it from reaching the dangerous levels of the core itself. "The quantum processing core," Hayes said with a hint of pride. 50,000 qubits operating in quantum superposition. More processing power than all classical computers on Earth combined. Reed stared at the device with new appreciation. And this is what the attackers are trying to compromise. Not just compromise, Hayes corrected. Weaponize. Guardian's defensive capabilities are formidable, but Chimera's offensive reach is far greater than most people realize. In the wrong hands, it could cripple global infrastructure. She moved to a specialized terminal near the core. "I need to implement a hardware-level isolation protocol. It's a fail-safe I built into the original design, but never documented in the official specifications." "A backdoor," Reed asked, his tone suggesting disapproval of such security violations. Hayes shook her head as her fingers flew across the specialized interface. "Not a backdoor. Those are vulnerable by definition. This is more like a circuit breaker that can only be activated from this physical location. It severs the quantum entanglement between core processing units, essentially creating discrete systems that can't communicate with each other." Reed watched as she worked, his expression reflecting the internal struggle between his ingrained respect for protocol and his growing recognition of Hayes's extraordinary capabilities. "Why wasn't this feature included in the official documentation?" he asked finally. Hayes paused, considering how to answer. This was a fundamental philosophical difference between them, one worth addressing even in the midst of crisis. "Captain, throughout military history, there's been a tension between transparency and security. Documentation creates accountability, but also vulnerability." She continued, working as she spoke. "In cyber warfare, complete documentation means providing a roadmap for defeating your own systems. Some protections must remain known only to their creators. But doesn't that undermine the chain of command? If only you know about these safeguards." "It does," Hayes admitted. "And that's a legitimate concern. But in this domain, there are no perfect solutions, only trade-offs between different kinds of vulnerability." Reed considered this, seeing the issue from a new perspective. "How do you decide which vulnerabilities are acceptable?" "By considering the consequences of failure," Hayes replied. "In this case, I judged that the risk of unauthorized activation was less severe than the risk of this safeguard being defeated through documentation." The terminal displayed a warning. "Warning, quantum coherence interruption will result in temporary system incapacity. Proceed YN." Hayes entered Y without hesitation. The cylindrical core emitted a high-pitched whine as internal mechanisms realigned. The frost patterns on its surface shifted, creating beautiful crystalline structures that morphed and evolved in real time. "What exactly are you doing?" Reed asked, fascinated, despite the urgency of their situation. "I'm physically separating the offensive and defensive capabilities of the system," Hayes explained. "By breaking quantum coherence between these components, I'm ensuring that even if the attackers gain control of the defensive systems, They can't access Chimera's offensive toolset. The terminal displayed a progress bar that moved with agonizing slowness. 3 minutes to completion, Hayes noted. We need to return to the command center to implement the software side of this isolation. As they turned to leave, a new alarm sounded different from the previous warnings. This was a high-pitched, pulsating tone that Reed recognized immediately. "Core coolant system failure," he said, his voice tight. "The superconducting magnets will lose containment without active cooling." Hayes moved to a different terminal, quickly assessing the situation. "The attackers have found another vector. They're forcing a hardware failure to prevent our countermeasures." "What happens if the cooling system fails completely?" Reed asked. "Quantum decoherence followed by catastrophic system failure," Hayes replied, "and potentially a helium coolant breach into this facility." Reed paled. "The liquid helium is kept at 4 Kelvin. If it vaporizes into this space, it would flash freeze everything in this room, including us," Hayes finished. "We need to stabilize the coolant system before we can return to the command center." She studied the coolant system schematic on the terminal. "The primary circulation pumps have been compromised through their control systems. We need to switch to the manual backup pumps." Reed moved to a control panel on the far wall. Manual systems are designed to be isolated from network control, but they're much less efficient. "Efficiency doesn't matter right now. Survival does." As Reed worked on the manual override, a sudden crack echoed through the chamber. One of the coolant pipes had developed a hairline fracture, releasing a thin white plume of super-cold gas. The temperature in the room dropped precipitously, their breath immediately visible in the frigid air. "Containment breach," Hayes said, her voice still calm despite the escalating danger. "We have minutes, possibly seconds, before this room becomes uninhabitable." Reed's military training took over. "We need to seal this section and evacuate. If we leave now, the core will fail completely," Hayes countered. "Everything we've done will be meaningless." She moved toward the damaged pipe, assessing the breach. "There's an emergency repair kit near the entrance. We can temporarily seal the fracture while the manual pumps stabilize the system." Reed retrieved the kit and returned to find Hayes already positioning herself near the leak, her movements careful in the rapidly cooling air. Frost was beginning to form on exposed metal surfaces, and the edges of their clothing were stiffening. "This will require both of us," Hayes explained. "I'll apply the sealant compound while you maintain pressure on the surrounding area to prevent the crack from spreading." Reed nodded, understanding the risk they were taking. If the crack expanded suddenly or the pipe ruptured completely, they would be engulfed in liquid helium at near absolute zero temperatures. Death would be nearly instantaneous. They worked in tense silence, their hands already painful from the extreme cold. The repair compound needed precise application, and Hayes moved with surgical precision, despite fingers that were rapidly losing sensation. Reed maintained steady pressure, using his considerable strength to stabilize the damaged section. "Almost there," Hayes said quietly. "The compound needs 30 seconds to cure." Those 30 seconds stretched like hours. The temperature continued to drop. Ice crystals formed on their eyelashes and the exposed skin of their faces. Breathing became painful as the frigid air seared their lungs. Finally, Hayes nodded. "It's sealed. Now we need to restart the circulation." Reed returned to the control panel, his movements increasingly stiff as hypothermia began to set in. The manual pumps engaged with a low mechanical groan, pushing fresh coolant through the system. The temperature gauges, which had been climbing dangerously, began to stabilize. Holding at 4.2 Kelvin, Reed reported, his voice hoarse from the cold, within operational parameters, but just barely. Hayes nodded, her face pale with cold, but expression resolute. "It will have to do. The hardware isolation is at 70%. We need to get back to the command center to coordinate with Parker on the software countermeasures. As they moved toward the exit, a violent tremor shook the facility. The lights flickered, and for a moment they were plunged into total darkness before the emergency systems re-engaged. "What was that?" Reed asked, steadying himself against a wall. Hayes's expression grew even more serious. "Protocol Omega Level 3 just initiated. We're too late to prevent it." In the command center, Ensign Parker was fighting his own battle against the digital invasion. Working with Lawrence and the remaining technical staff, he had managed to isolate certain critical systems from the spreading corruption. But the main Guardian architecture continued its inexorable progression toward Level 3 activation. 1 minute to Level 3 initiation, the system announced. Parker's fingers flew across his keyboard, attempting to implement the countermeasures Hayes had outlined before departing for the core. The white circle in the holographic display was holding, but had begun to pulse erratically as the red corruption pressed against it from all sides. Montgomery's holographic presence remained in the command center, coordinating between Fort Meade and the Pentagon crisis team. Parker status report. Admiral Hayes' defensive perimeter is holding, sir, but the attack is intensifying. I'm seeing new patterns emerging in the code structure, adaptive algorithms that are probing for weaknesses. Montgomery nodded grimly. The Pentagon reports unusual network activity across all military branches. It appears the attackers anticipated our broken arrow protocols and prepared secondary intrusion vectors. Lawrence approached the holographic projection. "Sir, we've managed to isolate the facility's environmental and security systems. Even if Guardian is fully compromised, the attackers won't be able to control physical access or life support." "Small comfort if Chimera's offensive capabilities are turned against our infrastructure," Montgomery replied. "Where are Hayes and Reed?" "Still at the quantum core, sir."
"Should they—"
A violent tremor interrupted Lawrence, shaking the command center and causing several displays to flicker. Warning klaxons added their urgent wailing to the already chaotic soundscape. "Protocol Omega Level 3 initiated," announced the system with the same calm synthetic voice that had been counting down the crisis. "Deploying counteroffensive measures against identified hostile networks." Parker stared in horror at his display. "Sir, Chimera is activating its targeting. It's targeting our own defense networks." The main holographic display transformed, showing a global map with hundreds of red lines emanating from Fort Meade, reaching toward military installations, communications centers, power grids, and transportation hubs across the United States and allied nations. It's interpreting our entire digital infrastructure as hostile, Lawrence said, his voice hollow with shock. Montgomery's expression remained composed, but his eyes reflected the gravity of the moment. "The attack is more sophisticated than we anticipated. It's not just compromising Guardian, it's inverting its targeting parameters." Parker worked frantically at his terminal, trying to interrupt the deployment sequence. "I can't stop it, sir. The system is locked into its autonomous response protocols." Montgomery turned to address someone off-screen at the Pentagon. "Implement Black Forest contingency. All critical infrastructure is to be physically disconnected from networks immediately." Throughout the country, emergency teams began the process of manually disconnecting essential systems from the Internet. Power plants, water treatment facilities, air traffic control centers, and hospital networks initiated emergency isolation protocols designed for extreme cyber attacks. In the command center, Parker suddenly straightened in his chair. "Sir, I'm detecting a new signal in the system. It's originating from the quantum core." On the main display, the pulsing white circle suddenly expanded, pushing back against the red corruption with renewed strength. Complex patterns of code, different from both the attack signature and Guardian's normal operations, began to spread through the system architecture. "That's Admiral Hayes," Parker said, a note of awe in his voice. "She's implementing something I've never seen before." The door to the command center slid open, and Hayes entered with Reed close behind. Both showed signs of their ordeal in the core chamber, faces pale with cold frost still visible on their uniforms. Hayes moved immediately to Parker's terminal, taking control of the interface with swift, precise movements. "The quantum core has been isolated," she announced. "I've broken coherence between the offensive and defensive systems. Chimera can still activate, but it's been severed from Guardian's targeting protocols." "Will that stop the attack?" Lawrence asked. "No, but it limits the damage," Hayes replied. "More importantly, it gives us a foundation to build our counteroffensive." She turned to Parker. "Ensign, the code I uploaded from the core contains a quantum signature verification protocol. Deploy it through your defensive perimeter." Parker nodded and began implementing her instructions. On the main display, the white circle pulsed brightly, then began to expand more rapidly, pushing back the red corruption in irregular patterns. "It's working," Parker reported. "The verification protocol is identifying and neutralizing compromised code segments." Hayes moved to the central command station, her focus absolute, as she coordinated the counteroffensive. The attackers exploited a theoretical vulnerability in Protocol Omega's recursive authentication system. By triggering a specific sequence of verification failures, they created a cascade effect that the system interpreted as a massive coordinated attack. "But there was no actual attack until that point?" Reed asked, following her reasoning. "Correct. The initial trigger was merely a sophisticated phishing expedition. Once Protocol Omega activated, it created the very network anomalies it was designed to detect, establishing a feedback loop that amplified with each cycle." Montgomery's holographic image studied the main display with growing comprehension. "They turned our own defensive system against us. Elegant, if apocalyptically dangerous." "But why?" Reed asked. "What's the strategic objective?" Hayes paused, her gray eyes meeting Reed's directly for the first time since their confrontation. "Captain, I believe we're looking at a proof-of-concept operation. The attackers wanted to demonstrate that they could compromise our most secure system to send a message." "And what message?" "That no digital system is truly secure. That America's cyber dominance can be challenged." Her expression hardened slightly. "And most importantly, that they have penetrated our most classified programs and understand our methodology intimately." The implications hung heavily in the air. If foreign adversaries had gained such deep insight into America's cyber warfare capabilities, the strategic balance of power was more precarious than anyone had realized. A new alert sounded from Parker's terminal. "Admiral, I'm detecting a pattern in the attack code. It's almost like a signature." Hayes joined him at the terminal, studying the code segments he had isolated. Her expression changed subtly, a tightening around the eyes, a slight compression of the lips. It was the first indication of genuine surprise she had shown throughout the crisis. "It's definitely Chen's work," she said quietly. "Not just his methodology, but his personal signature. This particular sequence, a modified Fibonacci pattern with quantum prime factors, was something of a calling card he used to embed in his code." "A deliberate attribution," Montgomery suggested from his holographic presence. "Possibly," Hayes allowed. "Or it could be that whoever is using his techniques doesn't know about the signature. Either way, it confirms Chen's involvement, directly or indirectly." This revelation added a new dimension to the crisis. Not merely a foreign adversary exploiting a vulnerability, but potentially a disaffected insider with intimate knowledge of the system's architecture. Parker continued working at his terminal, implementing Hayes' countermeasures with increasing confidence. The white circle on the main display now covered nearly half the affected systems, pushing back the red corruption steadily. Admiral, the verification protocol is working. We're reclaiming compromised systems at an accelerating rate. Hayes nodded. Excellent work, Ensign. Now we need to trace the attack to its source. As she spoke, Reed approached quietly. Admiral, there's something you should know. Hayes looked up, noting the unusual hesitation in the captain's manner. Yesterday, we received an update package for Guardian security protocols. It came through standard channels with all appropriate authentications. My team implemented it immediately, following standard procedures. Hayes's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened with interest. And you're telling me this now because I'm beginning to suspect that the update may have been the initial infection vector, Reed admitted. If so, then I am indirectly responsible for allowing this breach. It was a difficult acknowledgement for a man of Reed's character admitting a mistake that may have endangered national security. That he did so without excuse or deflection revealed more about him than any success could have. Hayes studied him for a moment before responding. Captain's sophisticated cyber attacks often exploit the most fundamental aspects of trust in our systems. If this update was the vector, it means the attackers had access to our secure distribution channels and authentication protocols, a far more serious breach than any decision you made. She turned back to the main display, where the counteroffensive continued to gain ground. But your observation gives us another avenue to investigate. Parker analyzed the update package Captain Reed mentioned. Look for any anomalies in the authentication chain. As Parker began this new line of investigation, the white circle on the main display suddenly pulsed erratically. Several sections reverted to red as alarms sounded from multiple stations. We're losing ground in sectors 3 and 7, a technician called out. The attack is adapting to our countermeasures. Hayes moved swiftly to the affected terminal. They anticipated our response. This isn't just Chen's methodology. It's an evolution of it. She turned to address the entire command center. The attackers expected us to implement quantum signature verification. They've prepared a secondary exploitation strategy. Montgomery's holographic image leaned forward. Diana, what are we dealing with? A level of sophistication that suggests either a quantum computing breakthrough by our adversaries or, she paused, choosing her words carefully, or inside knowledge of our most recent security protocols. The implication was clear to everyone present. This wasn't merely a brilliant former officer using his knowledge against them. This was a coordinated operation with access to current classified information. Hayes made a rapid series of decisions. We need to change our approach. Fighting this code-to-code is exactly what they expect. Parker, implement Protocol Lazarus. Parker's eyes widened. Lazarus, ma'am, that's a complete system reversion. We'd lose all data and state from the past 48 hours. Better to lose 2 days of data than the entire system, Hayes replied. Lazarus will restore Guardian to its state before the suspected update, effectively amputating the infected portions. Reed stepped forward. Admiral Protocol Lazarus requires physical authentication from the facility commander. Hades met his gaze steadily. That would be you, Captain. It was a moment of truth for Reed. Implementing Lazarus meant accepting that his command had been compromised, that his decisions had potentially enabled the attack. It required both literal and figurative acknowledgement that he needed to relinquish control to save the system. Without hesitation, Reed moved to the command console and entered his authentication codes. Ready to implement Protocol Lazarus on your command, Admiral. Hayes nodded once, acknowledging both the professional decision and the personal growth it represented. Execute Protocol Lazarus. Reed entered the final command sequence. The main display flickered, and all operational indicators momentarily went dark. For 3 seconds, an eternity in computational terms, Guardian ceased to exist as an operational system. When the displays reactivated, they showed clean, orderly patterns of blue and green code. The red corruption had vanished along with all system states and data from the previous 48 hours. Guardian is reverting to secure backup state from 0600 2 days ago, Parker reported. All corrupted code segments have been purged. A collective breath of relief passed through the command center. The immediate crisis appeared to be contained. Chimera's offensive capabilities had been prevented from causing widespread damage to American infrastructure. The mysterious attackers had been repelled at least temporarily, but Hayes's expression remained grave as she studied the restored systems. This wasn't a victory. It was merely the successful management of a potential catastrophe. The underlying threat remained. Someone had penetrated America's most secure cyber warfare system using techniques developed by their own experts, potentially with inside knowledge of current protocols. The implications for national security were profound and disturbing. As the command center staff began recovery procedures, Hayes moved to a quiet corner where Montgomery's holographic image waited. "This isn't over, James," she said quietly. Montgomery nodded, his weathered face solemn. "I know. The question is, who are we really fighting? And how many more systems have they already compromised without triggering such obvious alarms?" Hayes added. Their eyes met across the digital divide, the veteran admiral nearing the end of his career, and the brilliant woman who represented the future of naval warfare. Both recognized that they had just witnessed the opening moves in a new kind of conflict, one that would define the coming decades of global security. In another corner of the command center, Captain Reed watched them with new understanding. The arrogance that had defined his career was giving way to something more valuable. The wisdom to recognize true expertise and the courage to acknowledge his own limitations. Reed approached Hayes slowly, gathering his thoughts. This was perhaps the most difficult conversation of his career, but necessary. "Admiral," he began, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "What happened today went beyond professional failure on my part. It was a fundamental error in judgment, not just about you, but about how I've approached command itself." Hayes turned to face him, her expression neither condemning nor forgiving, simply attentive. "I've always believed that authority comes with rank, and that respect must be commanded." Reed continued, "Today showed me that true authority comes from competence, and respect must be earned through actions, not demanded through position." Hayes studied him thoughtfully. "That's a difficult lesson for anyone to learn, Captain, especially someone with your background and training." "Yes, it is," Reed acknowledged, "but necessary. I wanted you to know that I understand the gravity of my actions, both the personal and professional implications. Whatever disciplinary measures follow, I accept them without reservation." "Your actions during the crisis demonstrated capacity for growth," Hayes replied. "That matters more than your initial mistake. The Navy doesn't need perfect officers, Captain. It needs officers who can learn from failure." Reed straightened slightly, accepting both the criticism and the acknowledgement. "Thank you, Admiral." The alarms had fallen silent. The red emergency lighting had reverted to standard operational blue. Guardian had been saved. But as the immediate danger receded, a deeper awareness took its place. This was not an isolated incident, but the harbinger of a new kind of warfare, one fought in shadows with weapons that left no physical traces but could devastate entire nations. The crisis was contained, but the battle had only begun. The soft blue operational lighting had returned to the command center of Fort Meade Naval Cyber Command. The chaotic symphony of alarms had fallen silent, replaced by the steady, reassuring hum of systems functioning as designed. To an outside observer, it might have appeared that normalcy had been restored. But for those who had weathered the crisis, nothing would ever be quite the same again. Admiral Diana Hayes stood at the central command console, her gray eyes studying the restored Guardian system with analytical precision. Protocol Lazarus had successfully reverted the system to its state before the suspected infection, effectively amputating the compromised portions. The immediate danger had passed, but Hayes knew better than to confuse a tactical victory with strategic resolution. "We've contained the breach," she announced to the assembled staff, her voice calm yet carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. "But we need to understand that what we've experienced today represents a fundamental shift in the cyber warfare landscape." Commodore Lawrence approached his expression grave. "The Pentagon is demanding a full briefing. They want to know exactly what happened and who was behind it." "So do I," Hayes replied. "But first, we need to secure this facility against further infiltration attempts. The attackers may have backup strategies ready to deploy once they realize their primary assault has failed." She turned to Ensign Parker, who had barely left his terminal during the entire crisis. Despite the exhaustion evident in his young face, his eyes remained alert and focused. "Ensign, I want a complete analysis of the attack methodology. Focus particularly on the elements that appear to incorporate David Chen's techniques. Look for modifications or evolutionary adaptations that might indicate who developed them further." Parker nodded. "Yes, Admiral. I'll need to cross-reference with the classified Chimera development archives." "You'll have full access," Hayes assured him. "Use the secure terminal in my temporary office." Captain Reed had been organizing the technical teams for recovery operations, his military efficiency reasserting itself after the chaos of the crisis. He approached Hayes with the formal bearing of a man who had accepted difficult truths about himself. "Admiral, I've implemented your containment protocols. All external connections remain severed, and we're operating on isolated backup systems." Hayes acknowledged his report with a nod. "Thank you, Captain. I'll need a full accounting of that security update your team implemented yesterday. Who authorized it, who delivered it, and the complete chain of custody." "Already underway," Reed confirmed. "Preliminary investigation suggests the update came through proper channels, with all authentication protocols intact. If it contained the infection vector, then our entire verification system has been compromised." Hayes processed this disturbing possibility without visible reaction, though its implications were profoundly unsettling. A breach of the authentication system would represent a level of penetration far beyond a single tactical strike. Montgomery's holographic presence had remained in the command center throughout the recovery operations. Now he addressed Hayes directly. "Diana, the President, has been briefed on the situation. He's convening an emergency meeting of the National Security Council in 30 minutes. The Joint Chiefs will be there along with the directors of NSA, CIA, and FBI." Hayes raised an eyebrow slightly, the only indication of her surprise at the high-level response. "And they want me to brief them through this connection." "No," Montgomery replied. "They want you there in person. A helicopter is already en route to bring you to Andrews Air Force Base. From there, you'll be flown directly to the White House." This was unprecedented. Pulling the operational commander from a crisis site for an in-person briefing suggested the situation had implications far beyond a single cyber attack. "James, we're still assessing the damage here. I need to oversee the forensic analysis." "You have capable people who can handle that," Montgomery countered. "What the President and the NSC need is your strategic assessment of what this attack represents. You're the only one who fully understands both the technical details and the broader implications." Hayes considered this for a moment, then nodded once. "Very well. I'll prepare for transport. She turned to Lawrence. "Commodore, you have operational command until my return. Maintain isolation protocols and continue the forensic analysis. I want hourly reports on any findings." "Understood, Admiral." Hayes then faced Reed directly. "Captain, I need you to compile a complete operational history of this facility for the past month. Every personnel change, every system update, every unusual occurrence, no matter how minor it might have seemed at the time." Reed straightened. "Yes, Admiral." "And Admiral Hayes," he hesitated briefly, then continued with military directness. "I wish to formally acknowledge my failure to recognize your authority and my subsequent inappropriate actions. There is no excuse for my behavior, and I accept full responsibility for any consequences." It was a difficult statement for a man of Reed's background and temperament, a public admission of error and an explicit acceptance of responsibility. The command center fell silent as staff members pretended not to listen while hanging on every word. Hayes studied Reed for a long moment before responding. "Captain Reed, your actions during the crisis demonstrated your capacity to set aside personal considerations in service to your country. That speaks to your fundamental character more eloquently than any momentary lapse in judgment. We'll address the formal aspects of this morning's incident at an appropriate time. For now, we have more urgent matters to attend to." Her response offered neither absolution nor condemnation, simply a pragmatic prioritization of national security over personal issues. Yet there was also an implicit recognition that Reed's response to the crisis had revealed qualities more significant than his initial mistake. As Hayes prepared to depart for the White House, Parker approached with a data tablet. "Admiral, I've isolated something you should see before you leave." But Hayes examined the information on the screen, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. After a moment, she looked up at Parker with new appreciation in her eyes. "You found this pattern on your own?" Parker nodded suddenly, self-conscious under her intense focus. "Yes, ma'am. It reminded me of something I studied in advanced cyber forensics at the Academy. The embedding technique is distinctive." "It is indeed," Hayes agreed. "And it confirms what I suspected." She transferred the data to her secure tablet. "Excellent work, Ensign. This will be valuable for my briefing." The distant sound of helicopter rotors announced the arrival of her transport. Hayes prepared to depart, but paused to address the command center staff one final time. "What happened here today was not a random cyber attack. It was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of capability by an adversary who understands our systems intimately. The fact that you prevented catastrophic damage is commendable. But make no mistake, this was merely the opening move in a new kind of conflict. Stay vigilant. I'll return as soon as possible." With those sobering words, Hayes departed for what would prove to be one of the most consequential national security meetings in recent history. The White House Situation Room presented a stark contrast to the technological environment of Fort Meade. Where the Cyber Command Center had been dominated by holographic displays and advanced interfaces, this room maintained a deliberate traditionalism, polished wood-leather chairs, and understated displays that belied the critical decisions made within these walls. Hayes had barely had time to review her notes during the hurried flight to Washington. Now she stood before the assembled leadership of America's national security apparatus, her plain flight suit exchanged for a properly uniformed appearance that reflected her admiral's rank. The president sat at the center of the conference table, flanked by the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Advisor. The Joint Chiefs occupied one side while the intelligence agency directors sat opposite. Admiral Montgomery, having returned from the Pentagon, was present in person, his weathered face a mask of professional concern. "Admiral Hayes," the president began, "I understand you've just come from the front lines of what could have been the most significant cybersecurity breach in our history. We need to understand exactly what happened, who was responsible, and what it means for national security going forward. Hayes stood at the head of the table, her posture reflecting decades of military discipline. Mr. President, members of the Council, what occurred at Fort Meade this morning was not simply a cyber attack. It was a demonstration of capability, a proof of concept operation designed to show that our most secure systems can be compromised. She activated a secure presentation on the room's main display. The attackers exploited a theoretical vulnerability in Protocol Omega Guardian's primary defense system. This vulnerability was known to only a handful of people with the highest security clearances. Its exploitation indicates either an internal breach of classified information or a level of technical sophistication that exceeds our current assessment of adversary capabilities. The FBI director leaned forward. "You're suggesting this was an inside job." "I'm stating that the attack methodology incorporated techniques developed by former Naval Intelligence Officer David Chen, who worked on the original Chimera project until his discharge in 2015. Whether Chen himself was involved remains to be determined." The CIA director exchanged glances with his NSA counterpart. "Chen defected to China 3 years ago. We've been tracking his movements, but lost contact approximately 6 months ago." This was news to Hayes, though she betrayed no surprise. That would explain certain aspects of the attack signature. However, the implementation goes beyond Chen's original methodology. It includes adaptations and evolutions that suggest collaborative development. "Are you saying the Chinese have achieved quantum computing capability equivalent to ours?" asked the Secretary of Defense. "Not necessarily," Hayes replied. "But they may have combined Chen's knowledge with their own research to develop hybrid approaches we hadn't anticipated. More concerning is the evidence that the attack originated through a security update that passed all our authentication protocols." She displayed the findings Parker had discovered just before her departure. This embedded signature appears in fragments throughout the corrupted code. When assembled, it forms a pattern that corresponds to a specific division within the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force, their elite cyber warfare unit. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Not merely a rogue former officer, but a state-sponsored operation with the full backing of Chinese military intelligence. "Why now?" the president asked finally. "What strategic objective does this serve?" Hayes considered the question carefully before responding. "In my assessment, Mr. President, this attack served multiple objectives. First, it demonstrated capability, proving they could penetrate our most secure systems if they chose to. Second, it provided valuable intelligence on our response protocols and capabilities. Third, and perhaps most significantly, it established leverage for future negotiations." "Leverage?" the National Security Advisor questioned. "By demonstrating this capability without causing catastrophic damage, they've sent a message: we could have done worse, but chose not to. That implied restraint becomes a bargaining chip in future diplomatic or military confrontations." Montgomery nodded his agreement. "It's a classic naval strategy, adapted to the cyber domain. When nations used to conduct naval exercises just outside territorial waters, they weren't merely practicing, they were demonstrating capability while exercising restraint. The message was clear: we could enter your waters if we chose to, but we're choosing not to today." The president leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "Admiral Hayes, what is your recommendation for immediate response?" "3 priorities, Mr. President. First, comprehensive security review of all critical infrastructure and defense systems, focusing on authentication protocols for updates and patches. Second, establishment of an elite cyber forensics team to reverse engineer the attack methodology and develop countermeasures. Third, diplomatic communication through secure channels to acknowledge the demonstration without confirming specific vulnerabilities. Acknowledge it, the Secretary of Defense looked incredulous. Wouldn't that be admitting weakness? On the contrary, Hayes replied, it would be demonstrating situational awareness and confidence. The message should be clear: we detected your operation, contained it, and are now addressing the vulnerabilities you attempted to exploit. Future attempts will be met with proportional response. The President studied Hayes with new appreciation. Her recommendations balanced technical understanding with strategic wisdom, a rare combination in the specialized world of modern warfare. Admiral, I'm authorizing you to implement your first two recommendations immediately. The diplomatic response will require further discussion. And he turned to address the entire council. I want a complete security review of all critical systems within 48 hours. Assume compromise until proven otherwise. As the meeting continued, Hayes provided detailed technical briefings on the attack methodology and potential countermeasures. Throughout the discussion, she maintained the same calm precision that had characterized her response during the crisis itself. 3 hours later, as the meeting concluded, the President asked Hayes to remain behind along with Montgomery. When the others had departed, he addressed them directly. Admirals, what happened today represents a fundamental shift in our security landscape. We need to adapt accordingly. He turned specifically to Hayes. I'm establishing a new Joint Cyber Defense Command, with authority over all military branches and direct coordination with civilian infrastructure protection. I want you to lead it. Hayes maintained her professional composure, though the offer represented an extraordinary promotion and expansion of responsibility. Mr. President, that would require significant restructuring of current command hierarchies. Yes, it would, the President agreed. Which is precisely why you're the right person for the job. You understand both the technical complexities and the institutional challenges. Montgomery spoke up. If I may, Mr. President, I believe Admiral Hayes is indeed the right choice. But such a transition will face resistance from traditional command structures. She'll need political capital to implement the necessary changes. The President nodded. She'll have it, including direct reporting authority to this office. He looked directly at Hayes. Admiral, you have 48 hours to develop an implementation plan for this new command structure. In the meantime, return to Fort Meade and complete your investigation of today's incident. I want to know exactly how they got in and how to ensure they can't do it again. Yes, Mr. President. As Hayes and Montgomery departed the White House, the older admiral allowed a small smile to cross his weathered face. I told you years ago that you'd change the way the Navy thinks about warfare. I just didn't anticipate how dramatic that change would be. Hayes shook her head slightly. This isn't about me, James. It's about recognizing that the nature of conflict has fundamentally changed. The traditional boundaries between military branches, between offensive and defensive operations, between war and peace, they're all becoming increasingly blurred in the cyber domain. Montgomery nodded. True enough, but it still takes the right person to lead that transformation. He paused, studying his protégé with evident pride. You handled Reed remarkably well, by the way. Captain Reed made mistakes, but he demonstrated character when it mattered most, Hayes replied. That's worth nurturing, not discarding. A lesson many commanders never learn, Montgomery noted. Now, shall we return to Fort Meade? I believe you have a revolution to plan. When Hayes and Montgomery returned to Fort Meade that evening, they found the command center transformed. Under Lawrence's direction, the staff had implemented a comprehensive security lockdown while simultaneously conducting the forensic analysis Hayes had ordered. Parker had been working without breaks, fueled by caffeine, and the rare opportunity to apply his skills alongside the legendary Diana Hayes. He looked up from his terminal as they entered, exhaustion evident in his young face, but pride shining in his eyes. "Admiral, I think we've found something significant." He led Hayes to his workstation where complex data patterns filled multiple screens. The attack didn't just exploit the Protocol Omega vulnerability. It systematically mapped our entire system architecture, while the main breach distracted our attention. Hayes studied the evidence with growing concern. They weren't just demonstrating capability. They were conducting reconnaissance. "Yes, ma'am. And there's more." Parker highlighted a particular data pattern. "This scanning signature suggests they were searching for something specific within our secure databases." "What target?" "Based on the search parameters, they appear to have been looking for information about Project Sentinel." Hayes and Montgomery exchanged significant glances. Project Sentinel was a classified next-generation defensive system still in early development, a potential successor to Guardian that incorporated advanced artificial intelligence and quantum encryption techniques. "How would they even know about Sentinel?" Lawrence asked, joining the conversation. "That project is compartmentalized beyond top secret." "That's the most disturbing question," Hayes agreed. "And it brings us back to the possibility of a security breach beyond Chen's defection." Captain Reed approached, carrying a data tablet with his findings. "Admiral, I've completed the operational history you requested. There's something unusual you should see." He displayed a personnel record showing temporary access authorizations for the facility. 3 weeks ago, we hosted a delegation from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They were conducting a classified review of quantum computing applications. Among their technical staff was this individual. The image showed a young Asian woman identified as Dr. Mei Zhang, quantum computing specialist. According to her credentials, Dr. Zhang was born in the United States to Chinese immigrant parents and has worked for DARPA for the past 5 years. Reed continued. "However, when I contacted DARPA Security to verify her background, they had no record of anyone by that name ever working for the agency." Hayes examined the record carefully. "She had access to secure areas, limited access to non-classified systems only," Reed confirmed. "But she was here for 3 days, and security camera footage shows her in several restricted areas beyond her authorization, always in the company of credentialed staff members." Reed tapped his tablet, bringing up security footage that showed Dr. Zhang engaged in what appeared to be casual conversation with a senior systems engineer near a restricted terminal. As they talked, she subtly positioned herself to observe the engineer's keystrokes as he entered his access codes. In another clip, she appeared to accidentally bump into a desk, leaving behind what looked like an ordinary pen. "Social engineering," Montgomery commented. "A classic technique. Gain limited access legitimately, then exploit human courtesy and assumptions to extend that access." "And likely left behind hardware exploits," Hayes added, noting the pen. "Signal interceptors disguised as ordinary objects." Reed nodded grimly. "We've already begun a sweep for unauthorized devices. 3 have been found so far, including that pen which contains a sophisticated keylogger and transmission device." Hayes turned to Lawrence. "We need to expand the investigation. If Zhang gained access here, she may have infiltrated other facilities as well." She faced Reed again. "Captain, I'm placing you in charge of a comprehensive security review. You'll visit each major Cyber Command installation and implement enhanced verification protocols." Reed straightened, recognizing both the responsibility and the opportunity for redemption this assignment represented. "Yes, Admiral. When do I begin?" "Immediately. Commodore Lawrence will provide the necessary authorizations." Hayes then addressed Parker. Ensign, your performance during this crisis has been exemplary. I'm temporarily assigning you to my direct command for the development of countermeasures against this new threat methodology. The young officer's eyes widened at this extraordinary opportunity. Thank you, Admiral. I won't let you down. As the command center returned to its operational rhythm, Hayes stepped aside for a private conversation with Montgomery. James, we need to consider that Chen might not be working voluntarily with Chinese intelligence. Montgomery raised an eyebrow. You think they coerced him? It's a possibility we should explore. The signature he embedded in the code, it could be a message, not just a calling card. She paused, weighing her next words carefully. Chen had ethical concerns about Chimera's capabilities. He wouldn't willingly unleash them against civilian infrastructure. People change, Diana, especially when national loyalties come into play. True, but I knew him well. His opposition to Chimera was based on principle, not politics. Hayes's expression softened slightly with memory. He once told me that the most dangerous weapons are those that can't distinguish between soldiers and civilians. He would consider today's attack as proof of his warnings. You want to try to reach out to him, Montgomery stated, recognizing the direction of her thoughts. Through back channels, yes. If he is being coerced, he might be willing to provide intelligence on Chinese cyber capabilities. Montgomery considered this. It's risky. If he's willingly defected, any approach could alert them to our suspicions. Which is why we need to be subtle. Use the quantum entanglement channels we developed when he was still with the program. If anyone could maintain a covert QEC receiver in China, it would be Chen. I'll see what I can arrange through intelligence assets, Montgomery agreed. But tread carefully, Diana. Personal history can cloud judgment, even yours. Hayes acknowledged the warning with a nod. I'll remain objective, but we need to explore every avenue both to understand the threat and to potentially turn it to our advantage. Their conversation was interrupted by Lawrence, who approached with a concerned expression. Admiral, we've completed the initial security sweep. The situation is worse than we thought. He handed Hayes a data tablet with the findings. The devices planted by Zhang weren't just passive collectors. They were actively transmitting data to an external server. Based on the transmission logs, they've been operational for nearly 3 weeks. Hayes processed this information, her expression grave. Any way to determine what specific data was compromised? The devices were sophisticated quantum-encrypted transmission pathways that leave minimal traces. But based on their placement, they would have had access to certain development servers containing early design parameters for Project Sentinel. The implications were profound. If Chinese intelligence had obtained details of America's next-generation cyber defense system, they could potentially build in vulnerabilities before it was even operational. We need to assume Sentinel has been compromised, Hayes said decisively. We'll need to redesign the core architecture from scratch. That would set the project back by years, Lawrence pointed out. Better delayed than vulnerable, Hayes replied. And we may be able to turn this to our advantage. Feed them modified information through channels they think are still secure. She turned back to the central command area. Gentlemen, what we're facing is not just a single attack, but a coordinated long-term strategic campaign. We need to respond accordingly. Over the next several hours, Hayes developed a comprehensive counter-strategy. It involved not just defensive measures, but an active approach to cyber warfare, anticipating threats, planting false information, and developing adaptive systems that could function even when partially compromised. As the night wore on, the immediate crisis response evolved into the framework for a fundamental redesign of America's cyber defense strategy. By morning, Hayes had developed the initial implementation plan the President had requested for the new Joint Cyber Defense Command. In her temporary quarters later that night, Hayes reviewed the day's events. The confrontation with Reed seemed like it had happened months ago, not hours. She felt a deep weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, the weight of responsibility for defending against threats that most people couldn't even conceptualize. Her tablet chimed with a notification. Parker had sent the final analysis of Chen's code signature. Hayes studied it carefully, noting patterns that would be meaningless to anyone who hadn't worked closely with Chen. Within the seemingly random sequence, she recognized a message encoded using a private cipher they had developed years ago. The message was brief but unmistakable. Not willing, watched, sentinel trap. Hayes sat back, processing the implications. Chen was sending a warning. He wasn't a willing participant. He was being coerced. And most importantly, the interest in Project Sentinel wasn't coincidental. It was the primary target all along. She secured the tablet and laid down, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. The game had changed, and the rules were still being written. But for the first time since the crisis began, she felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't just reacting anymore. They had a path forward. And perhaps an ally behind enemy lines. 1 year later, Admiral Diana Hayes stood at the podium in the newly established Trident Cyber Warfare Center. The facility represented a revolution in military training, seamlessly integrating traditional military discipline with the creative problem-solving skills needed for the digital battle space. Behind her, the Trident emblem symbolized naval tradition, adapted for a new era of warfare. Before her sat the inaugural class of advanced cyber warfare specialists, 100 officers and enlisted personnel from all military branches selected for both technical aptitude and adaptive thinking. They represented a new kind of warrior, trained to fight in domains where there were no traditional front lines, where attacks occurred at the speed of light, and where the most dangerous weapons were often invisible until they struck. At the back of the auditorium sat Admiral James Montgomery, now retired, but serving as a senior advisor to the program. His weathered face reflected satisfaction as he watched his protégé address the next generation of defenders. Beside him was Captain Alexander Reed, whose security review initiative had uncovered and neutralized 17 potential vulnerabilities across military networks. His experience during the Guardian crisis had transformed him into one of the most effective advocates for Hayes' new approach to cybersecurity. Lieutenant Michael Parker, recently promoted for his exceptional service, sat in the front row. His unique combination of technical brilliance and military discipline made him the perfect embodiment of the new generation of cyber warfare specialists the Trident Center was designed to produce. To the future of warfare, Hayes began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become her hallmark. You represent a new kind of defender warriors who operate in domains where there are no traditional front lines, where attacks occur at the speed of light, and where the most dangerous weapons are often invisible until they strike. She activated a holographic display showing a simplified representation of America's interconnected defense and infrastructure systems. The Guardian incident taught us a fundamental lesson about modern warfare. The traditional boundaries between military and civilian targets, between peace and conflict, between domestic and foreign threats, all have become increasingly blurred in the cyber domain. Our adversaries don't distinguish between these categories, and neither can we. The display shifted to show the new integrated defense architecture that had emerged from the crisis. Project Trident represents our response to this new reality. You will learn to think like both defenders and attackers, to understand systems at their most fundamental level, and to adapt to threats that may not even exist yet. Hayes paused, making eye contact with individual students throughout the auditorium. but technical skills alone are insufficient. The most sophisticated security system can be compromised by human error or arrogance. The Guardian incident began not with a technical failure, but with a failure to recognize expertise regardless of rank or appearance. Several students glanced toward Captain Reed, whose role in the incident had become a case study in leadership and accountability. Reed maintained a dignified posture, accepting his place in this cautionary tale without visible discomfort. That's why your training will emphasize not just technical competence, but character development, Hayes continued. You will learn to value expertise wherever it's found, to admit when you don't know something, and to collaborate across traditional boundaries. She gestured toward Montgomery in the back row. Admiral Montgomery likes to say that the most dangerous words in military history are, "I know what I'm doing." True expertise includes recognizing the limits of your knowledge and the value of others' perspectives. Hayes concluded her address with a challenge that would become the unofficial motto of the Trident Center. In the digital domain, the loudest voice rarely belongs to the most capable defender. Learn to listen for the quiet competence that often holds the solutions to our most complex problems. After the ceremony, Hayes joined Reed, Montgomery, and Parker in the center's secure briefing room. The wall displays showed real-time cyber threat assessments from around the globe, a constant reminder of the ongoing battle taking place in the digital domain. The FBI's counterintelligence operation finally captured Dr. Zhang last week. Hayes informed them, bringing up the intelligence report on the main screen. She was attempting to infiltrate the Quantum Computing Research Center at MIT. Any connection to HYN? Montgomery asked. No direct evidence, but her interrogation has revealed new details about the PLA's Strategic Support Force structure. They've established a specialized unit dedicated to quantum warfare, with HYN apparently leading their research division. Reed studied the intelligence summary. Have we made any progress on determining whether his involvement is voluntary? Our back-channel communications remain sporadic, but consistent with coercion rather than willing participation, Hayes replied. The messages we've received through the quantum entanglement channel have provided advance warning of 3 attempted infiltrations in the past 6 months. Could be deliberate misinformation, Montgomery cautioned. Possible but unlikely given the specific technical details he's provided. Our assessment is that he's walking a dangerous line, providing enough value to his handlers to maintain his position while sabotaging their most critical operations. Parker brought up a new display showing the architecture of Project Sentinel's redesigned core systems. The honeypot strategy appears to be working, Admiral. Our monitoring systems have detected multiple attempts to exploit the vulnerabilities we deliberately leaked through the compromised channels. Each attempt provides us with new intelligence on their methodologies. Hayes nodded with satisfaction. The old approach to security was building impenetrable walls. Our new approach accepts that no wall is truly impenetrable. Instead, we build systems that can detect intrusions, contain them, adapt to them, and even use them to our advantage. She turned to face her colleagues, her expression serious. That's why I've asked you all here today. We've received intelligence that suggests a new offensive operation may be in development. The pattern of probing attacks against our infrastructure has changed over the past 2 weeks. Reed studied the data with a tactician's eye. They're testing our response times rather than seeking vulnerabilities. That suggests preparation for a coordinated strike. Exactly, Hayes confirmed. And the timing coincides with upcoming diplomatic negotiations on technology transfer restrictions. Montgomery stroked his chin thoughtfully. Another demonstration of capability to establish negotiating leverage. Most likely, Hayes agreed. but potentially more damaging than the Guardian incident. Based on the pattern of reconnaissance, they're targeting multiple systems simultaneously: power grids, financial networks, transportation, infrastructure. A distributed attack would be harder to contain, Parker noted. We'd need to coordinate responses across multiple agencies and private sector entities. Hayes nodded. Which is why we're implementing Operation Resilient Shield. It's a new approach to cyber defense that focuses on rapid adaptation rather than prevention alone. She activated a detailed presentation on the main display. The strategy has three components. First, we're deploying adaptive defense systems that can function even when partially compromised. Second, we're establishing a unified command structure that cuts across traditional bureaucratic boundaries. And third, we're developing a civilian response protocol that integrates private infrastructure into our defense network. Reed reviewed the implementation plan with growing appreciation. This goes beyond traditional military approaches. You're essentially redefining the battlefield. Because our adversaries already have, Hayes replied. The distinction between military and civilian targets becomes meaningless when an attack on power grids can paralyze military response capabilities. Montgomery nodded in agreement. In the Cold War, we had clear lines. Military targets were distinct from civilian ones, at least in theory. In cyber warfare, those lines don't exist. Which is why our response can't be limited to military systems, Hayes concluded. We need a whole-of-society approach to digital resilience. As the briefing continued, they reviewed specific implementation details for Resilient Shield. Parker outlined the technical architecture, while Reed addressed the operational coordination aspects. Montgomery provided historical context that helped frame the strategic implications. The meeting concluded with a sobering assessment of the challenges ahead. The Guardian incident had been contained, but it represented merely the opening move in a new kind of conflict, one fought with code rather than kinetic weapons, but potentially just as devastating. One final item, Hayes said as they prepared to adjourn. The CIA has reported unusual activity at HYN's research facility in Shanghai. Satellite imagery shows increased security and what appears to be preparation for equipment relocation. They could be moving him to a more secure facility, Montgomery suggested. Or he could be in danger, Hayes countered. Our last communication from him warned of growing suspicion among his handlers. If they've discovered his back channel to us, the implication hung in the air. For all his past mistakes, HYN was now providing crucial intelligence that had helped prevent several potential attacks. We should prepare extraction contingencies, Reed suggested. If an opportunity arises, we should be ready to move. Hayes nodded. I've already initiated preliminary planning with Special Operations Command. But extracting an asset from a Chinese military research facility would be— She paused, searching for the appropriate word. Challenging, Montgomery supplied with characteristic understatement. To say the least, Hayes agreed. But we owe him that much, at least. As the meeting concluded, Hayes remained behind with Montgomery while Reed and Parker departed to implement their respective aspects of Resilient Shield. You've built something remarkable here, Diana, Montgomery said, gesturing to the Trident Center around them. In just 1 year, you've fundamentally changed how the military approaches cyber warfare. With considerable help, Hayes acknowledged. Especially from you. Montgomery waved away the credit. I just provided political cover. The vision was yours. Vision isn't enough without implementation, Hayes replied. And implementation requires support from people who understand both the technical requirements and the institutional challenges. They walked together through the facility's main training area, where teams of students were engaged in simulated cyber defense exercises. The scenario mimicked the Guardian incident, forcing trainees to identify and neutralize a recursive vulnerability while maintaining critical system functions. "What's your assessment of Reed?" Montgomery asked, watching the captain as he provided guidance to one of the training teams. "He's exceeded my expectations," Hayes admitted. "The security review initiative he developed has become the gold standard across all services. And more importantly, he's leveraged his experience to drive cultural change within traditional command structures. A remarkable transformation from the man who pinned you against a server rack," Montgomery observed dryly. "People are capable of growth when confronted with their limitations," Hayes replied. "Reed's greatest strength turned out to be his capacity to learn from failure." As they continued their tour, they passed the memorial wall, a simple but powerful tribute to those who had lost their lives in cyber attacks against critical infrastructure. Unlike traditional military memorials, this one included civilians, power plant workers, killed when control systems were compromised, hospital patients who died during ransomware attacks that disabled medical equipment, transportation workers lost when navigation systems were maliciously altered. "The true cost of this new form of warfare," Montgomery said quietly, pausing before the wall. Hayes nodded solemnly. "And a reminder of why our work matters. These aren't abstract systems we're protecting, they're the foundation of modern society." They continued to the Advanced Simulation Chamber, the heart of the Trident Center's training program. Through the observation window, they watched as a team of students worked collaboratively to counter a simulated intrusion. The diversity of the team was striking: officers and enlisted personnel from different service branches working together without regard for rank or background, each contributing unique skills to the collective defense. "They're learning," Montgomery noted with satisfaction. "Yes," Hayes agreed. "Not just technical skills, but the deeper lesson that true strength lies in recognizing and valuing diverse expertise regardless of rank or appearance." Their tour concluded at Hayes's office, where real-time threat assessments from around the globe were displayed on a curved wall of monitors. The complexity of the data was staggering, but Hayes had developed systems to identify patterns that might otherwise be missed early warning indicators of potential attacks. "One thing still bothers me about the Guardian incident," Montgomery said as they reviewed the latest intelligence. "The timing was too perfect. If you hadn't been there—" "I've had the same thought," Hayes admitted. "There are too many coincidences. My unscheduled inspection, the specific vulnerability being triggered, the physical confrontation that accelerated the system failure." "You think it was deliberate?" Montgomery asked, raising an eyebrow. "That you were meant to be there?" "I think it's a possibility we can't discount," Hayes replied. "The attack served multiple objectives, demonstrating capability gathering, intelligence, establishing leverage. But it also elevated my profile and led directly to the creation of this command." "You think they wanted you in this position?" Montgomery's skepticism was evident. "Not necessarily me specifically, but someone who would fundamentally reshape our approach to cyber defense." Hayes gestured to the facility around them. "This represents a significant shift in how we allocate resources, train personnel, and conceptualize national security. That kind of change creates both opportunities and vulnerabilities." "A chess move, thinking several steps ahead," Montgomery mused. "Perhaps, or I'm overanalyzing a fortuitous coincidence." Hayes smiled slightly. "Either way, we're better prepared now than we were a year ago." As Montgomery prepared to depart, he paused at the door. "Diana, there's one thing I've never asked you about that day. When Reed confronted you, why didn't you simply identify yourself immediately? It would have avoided the escalation." Hayes considered the question, one she had reflected on many times over the past year. I needed to see how the facility operated when leadership believed no one was watching. If I had identified myself immediately, I would have seen the performance they prepared for inspection, not the reality of daily operations. "And you got more than you bargained for," Montgomery noted. "Yes," Hayes acknowledged, "but I also learned something essential about the culture we needed to change." Reed's response was extreme, but it reflected broader institutional issues overvaluing rank and undervaluing expertise, prioritizing hierarchy over effectiveness. "A painful but necessary lesson," Montgomery concluded. "For all of us," Hayes agreed, "myself included." After Montgomery's departure, Hayes returned to her review of global threat assessments. The work never ended. New vulnerabilities emerged daily. Adversaries adapted their techniques constantly. But now, instead of relying on rigid hierarchies and impenetrable walls, America's cyber defenses were built on adaptive systems and capable people, a resilient network of expertise ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. Her secure communication device chimed with a priority alert. The monitoring system had detected unusual network activity originating from Shanghai, specifically from the facility where Chen was believed to be working. The pattern matched one of their pre-arranged emergency signals. Hayes immediately activated a secure communication channel to Special Operations Command. "This is Admiral Hayes' authorization code, Sierra Tango 97 Alpha. Initiate Operation Clockwork." The response was immediate. "Acknowledged, Admiral. Operation Clockwork is now active. Estimated time to position 6 hours." Hayes ended the transmission and turned back to the global threat display. Chen had activated their emergency protocol, which could mean only one thing: he needed extraction immediately. The operation they had planned as a contingency was now in motion. She accessed the secure QEC channel they had established with Chen, hoping for additional information, but the quantum link remained silent. Either he couldn't risk further communication, or he had lost access to the equipment. Hayes made a decision. "Computer alert Captain Reed and Lieutenant Parker to report to my office immediately. Priority Alpha." Within minutes, Reed and Parker arrived, both clearly aware that something significant had developed. "Dr. Chen has activated the emergency signal," Hayes informed them without preamble. "I've initiated Operation Clockwork. Special operations teams are moving into position, but we need to prepare for potential digital countermeasures." Reed nodded immediately, grasping the implications. "The extraction will likely trigger cyber retaliation. They'll want to limit what intelligence Chen can provide." "Exactly," Hayes confirmed. "Lieutenant Parker, I need you to implement the Sentinel Shield protocols we developed. Captain Reed, coordinate with the Joint Chiefs to ensure all critical systems are at maximum alert status." Both officers moved immediately to implement her directives, their training and experience allowing them to shift seamlessly from training exercises to actual crisis response. Hayes turned back to the global threat display, studying the patterns with intensified focus. The next 24 hours would be critical. If the extraction succeeded, they would gain invaluable intelligence about Chinese cyber capabilities directly from someone who had helped develop them. If it failed, they could face not only the loss of an important intelligence asset, but potentially a significant escalation in the ongoing digital conflict. The uncertain fate of David Chen, once her student, then her adversary, now potentially a crucial ally, weighed heavily on Hayes. But personal concerns had to remain secondary to the broader strategic imperatives. Whatever happened in Shanghai would have ripple effects throughout the global security landscape. As she watched Reed and Parker coordinate the crisis response, Hayes felt a measure of pride in what they had built over the past year. The Trident Center represented more than just a training facility or a new command structure. It embodied a fundamental shift in how America approached warfare in the digital age, valuing adaptability over rigidity, expertise over rank, and quiet competence over loud authority. The legend of what had happened that day at Fort Meade, now known throughout the service as Hayes' Correction, had become more than just a cautionary tale about mistaking appearance for capability. It had become the foundation of a new approach to warfare itself, one built on the recognition that, in the digital age, the quietest voices often carried the most crucial messages. The future remained uncertain, filled with invisible threats and unseen battlefields. But for the first time since the Guardian incident, Hayes felt confident that they were not merely reacting to the changing nature of conflict. They were helping to define it. The mission to extract HYN would be another pivotal moment in this ongoing evolution, potentially shifting the balance of power in ways that traditional military operations never could. As the crisis response accelerated around her, Hayes stood at the center of the storm, calm, and focused the quiet competence that had saved Guardian, now directed toward larger challenges. Whatever came next, they would face it with the lessons learned from that fateful day when a captain's arrogance met an admiral's expertise, and America's cyber defense began its transformation. The Trident Center's systems indicated that Operation Clockwork was proceeding according to plan. Special operations teams were moving into position near Shanghai, prepared to extract HYN if the opportunity presented itself. Meanwhile, digital defensive measures were being implemented across all critical infrastructure, anticipating potential retaliation. The digital war continued, invisible to most, but potentially devastating to all. And at its center stood Admiral Diana Hayes, the unassuming architect of a revolution in warfare. A revolution born not from technological advancement alone, but from the recognition that true power often comes wrapped in the most unassuming packages.